Welcome to our talk, JMPscare, Introspection for Binary-Only Fuzzing, by me, Dominik Maier, and Lukas Seidel from TU Berlin. Thank you for joining us today. First, we would like to jump into AFL. I'm certain that most of you have seen American Fuzzy Lob or AFL++ in the past. The UI is pretty easy to digest, and it gives you a lot of in-depth information about the current fuzzing run. So what you do see is you see the current runtime, you see how many paths have been found, you see the density of its coverage map, the speed, and at which part, in which stage it is right now. But all in all, this is all nice and it looks fancy and it's flashy in this ASCII art. But what does it really tell you about the fuzzer's performance? It can tell you it's a bit better than before. So if it in a given time X finds more paths, then it may be better. But even that is not certain. So you end up with a lot of inputs. All of these inputs lead to a new path. That much we know. But if you want to compare, for example, this fuzzer to another fuzzer, or you just implemented a new coverage, how would you know if it's better or worse? During our emulation of the MediaTek baseband, we collected a lot of different paths. We collected 5,000. This is not all of them are unique necessarily, because we started from our 3,800 or so unique ones and then just ran it for a few seconds to generate as much as traces as possible. And now we can work with this. Usually we would drop it into IDA and then use something like Lighthouse or into Ghidra and Dragon Dance it. But for the amount of files, we have 5,900 files, this is impractical. A, it is not really performant, and B, we're looking for something very specific, something very fuzzer specific, and at this, which branches the fuzzer didn't take, even though it could have. During a normal execution, you don't have this question. During a normal execution, you either take a branch or you don't. But here we have a few thousand paths that are different, mostly. And they all go sliced through the control flow graph somehow. And now the question arises, which of them we have not taken? Well, here comes JMPscare. Just a quick glance. Lukas will later describe it in depth. Now we want to run JMPscare. It takes the architecture and the base address. In this case, we don't need it because it's a firmware blob that's loaded at null. And then we can specify how many edges should be traversed for each jump that we take. This is important later. And well, let's go. So now it's starting to go through all 5,902 execution traces. And it's looking for all jumps in each trace and maps them so that later we have basically reduced them to a single file with information about each jump. So what was the motivation to create this tool? We found that complicated targets like this one require carefully crafted harnesses. But analyzing if the harness works at all is really hard. Usually the only way to tell is coverage increases or not. And often after you created the harness, development stops. However, we think that to have the main impact from fuzzing, a human has to reiterate what they did with the fuzzing harness and look at the shortcomings and maybe improve the fuzzer or at least the harness. So the goals for JMPscare are to provide deep insight into the whole fuzzing pipeline and queues and find limitations of the fuzzer. More concrete, to find interesting conditional jumps the fuzzer is not able to overcome, the things we call frontier. And the human in the loop can then use the insights to improve the fuzzer, the mutator, and the harness. Lukas will now tell you about the tool.
The JMPscare Toolkit consists of 3 parts, namely trace collection, analysis, and a disassembler plugin. So first of all, we have trace collection. The analysis part of JMPscare expects as its input a really simplistic execution trace. What that exactly means is we expect a file, an input file, with exactly one address per line. This address corresponds to one executed instruction. Such execution traces can be easily collected via various ways. It is especially straightforward during emulation, which is how we did it. We used a target emulated within Unicorn and fuzzed with AFL, so in combination we used the Unicorn AFL framework. And for this exact framework, we also readily provide plug-and-play solutions. So one Rust crate and one Python library, which you can just use in your existing harness to utilize it and collect these execution traces, which you can then put into the next stage, which is analysis. Here we can see an illustration of the algorithm applied during stage 2. So we have a control flow graph. The blue boxes are already covered basic blocks, so we have seen these, we have encountered these during our fuzzing runs, and the white ones are those we have not seen yet. So this means we can see, okay, these 2 blocks are separated by a conditional jump we were not yet able to overcome, so this is a frontier. Starting from there, we actually go behind this frontier, we traverse up to n edges and count how many unseen basic blocks are there, still white. And in this example, the one to the right has, like, even after only 2 jumps, after 2 edge traversals, 3 unseen basic blocks. So this might be especially interesting to a researcher. JMPscare's analysis has at the moment 2 steps, 2 levels, of which the first is available for x86-64, for MIPS, and for 32-bit ARM, including thumb. So in the first stage, we determine which conditional jumps were actually taken and which basic blocks were reached. And we do that over a vast number of execution traces. So you can actually use all the knowledge of your fuzzing run, of your generated corpus, to cross-analyze to gain new knowledge and insights. We use all these PC traces as inputs to our analysis tool, and the result is a list of jumps which were either always or never taken over all the PC traces we actually observed. The second stage of analysis we call potential new coverage analysis, and what we do here is we want to provide the researcher with additional knowledge and insights. We want to enrich the information we found during the first stage, and for this we come up with a heuristic for impactness or interestingness of a frontier we have previously found. So we take a user-specified number n here, and starting from each basic block behind each previously found frontier, we now traverse up to n branches. And then we count the number of previously unseen branches. So the researcher can gain like a first quick look at how meaningful a new branch, a new direction would be when he's, for example, extending his harness. So you want to see, okay, is it more worth to go into this direction or the other direction? And this could give you a first hint to where exactly look at. For unresolvable function calls, the user can also specify a weight. The idea here was that a function call, we cannot always resolve it because it is something like BLX R3, so something register dependent, or at least it's not trivially resolvable. But the researcher can then say, okay, potentially this function may be like super interesting here because it is a completely new function. I already have this knowledge. And this new function is like very big and this is where I want to go into. Or you can say, okay, I more or less don't care at all about these external function calls. We just want to have a look around inside this or that function. And this second stage is at the moment for the proof of concept available for ARM32-bit and thumb mode. Finally, the analysis tool outputs a human-readable text file, and this text file contains information, details about all the frontiers we have previously found. So the details here are the address, the condition of the conditional jump of the frontier, whether this condition was observed to be always true or always false, and finally, if applicable, the potential new coverage score. And at the bottom you can see an example line of an output file. And with that we come to the disassembler, namely the Binary Ninja plugin. And here we have prepared a little demonstration for you. Here we see the Binary Ninja reverse engineering suite, and we will now use the JMPscare plugin to import analysis data for our MediaTek baseband firmware. So first we go here into the ERC example directory of BaseSafe, and we will use the output of the analysis tool of JMPscare to load it into Binary Ninja. Here we are represented with the address of the blocking instruction, the condition code, whether the condition was always true or always false, and the PNC potential new coverage heuristic in the last column. We can of course sort by address or by other fields. Most interesting would be here the new coverage heuristic probably. So let's see what this one brings. Here we found a roadblock inside a pretty huge complex function we were about to fuzz. And when we have a look at the surroundings, we will actually notice that it is directly preceded by a second conditional jump, which is also detected to be a roadblock. So here the condition, color-coded by red inside the disassembly graph, is always false, and the other one is always true. We can now look around. We can use Binary Ninja to analyze where the jump would actually take us if we would find the matching condition or input which would actually switch our condition, and use this as new input, as new knowledge. So to reiterate, the complete pipeline would look something like this. We start with our fuzzer, for example AFL++, where we fuzz our input. In our example we had an emulated program, and with this emulated program we could easily use our plug-and-play solution for trace generation to record program counter trace. This trace, or more correctly these traces, these thousands of traces, we can then put into our JMPscare analysis tool, and we will generate a concise overview in human readable form and text form of all the branches we were able to find, and including the potential new coverage heuristic. And this file we can then finally load into our Binary Ninja plugin to look around what we were actually able to find to generate new insights and help to guide the researcher in extending the corpus or the harness or the approach in some other place.
Thank you, Lukas. So let's take a step back and look at what kinds of frontiers and basic blocks we even have in the binary like our MediaTek binary. The most obvious one is the one that's in the logs, which is the reached frontier. This one has been reached by the fuzzer already. Then there's the reachable ones that we know the fuzzer could reach if we would leave it running for long enough. And then we have the reachable behind frontier blocks. These are paths that are reachable in theory, but it would take an unreasonable amount of time. For example, if it would be a hash function that the fuzzer would have to solve, a password or something, and it currently doesn't have the ability to do so. Like if it is a compare with a string, but there's no compare logging and no compare splitting, it would be unable to solve it. And these are reachable behind frontiers. Here, manual aid is required. Inside JMPscare, we can either patch it directly in a binary ninja, or we would go and fix the harness. Then we have the reachable ones that are only reachable if we alter the precondition. So there is control flow to this path from our initial harness, but this is hidden behind state that cannot be changed simply by mutating the input. Here we have to adapt the harness or use a different snapshot, a different place to a different global state inside the target. And then, of course, there's the unreachable blocks, the ones that we from our current position can never reach in the binary. With this, I want to come to the evaluation. As reiterated and said a lot of times during this talk, we used the base safe fuzz queue, which itself fuzzed the MediaTek Helios X10 ARM firmware. We have collected 5,902 inputs. Not all of them are unique, but around 3,800 coming from the base safe queue should be unique inputs. And we executed 5,860 instructions on average, which is a rather long target, I would say, for unicorn-based fuzzing at least. We have a total of 4.16 million jumps, of which 1,099 are unique, and 270 of these 1,099 are unidirectional, so they are frontiers. If we would surpass them, we would reach new blocks. During the evaluation, we noticed that one of the main things is we have had a fixed message ID, and by altering the message ID spec conform, we can reach new parts of the baseband without altering the harness too much. What we did was we added new traces from the corpus of all traces, and then we plotted how the unique jumps taken evolve. Here you can see that, of course, in the beginning, it goes up quickly and then it stagnates, which is, gut feeling of every person who does fuzzing for a while. More interestingly, the frontiers go up to a point and then reach a maximum, and then they go down again. At the point where the curve tips, we assume that the fuzzer has found almost all reachable conditional jumps, but now it starts to find new paths, so the other side of this hard to reach jump, let's say. So it would, before that, only have gone down one side in the call graph, and now it starts finding the other side too, and basically starts to explore the program almost fully. And a similar tipping point can be observed in our coverage score. So in the beginning of fuzzing, the coverage score is pretty low still because there's just not many conditional jumps explored. Then around 50 traces, there is a turning point here too. So to conclude, JMPscare provides insight into the queue. It finds explorable parts of the binary that are interesting. It finds frontiers that are interesting to be explored and help the tester to improve their harness or even take a little shortcut with forced execution. The whole thing is open sourced and is still under active development over at fgsect/JMPscare. Thank you so much for your attention, and now we're open for questions.